religious opposition. We are going to see the formation of new nations, new nation states, the advancement of ideas such as nationalism, but also ideologies such as communism, socialism, and so on. And so this is our task today. And so as we begin the 18th century, as you've seen, there are both the developments in an increase in wealth, literacy, but also people are beginning to access more of products that they did not have as a result of economic productivity, industrialization, trade, and so on. The emergence of sovereignty as an idea, the ideas of popular sovereignty. So this is post the revolutions of the French, Haitian, and American republics. So in some you do see the emergence of popular sovereignty, popular rule, but in others you see a return to the past. So for example, the French Republic, we're going to see the restoration of kings until 1848, and then we are going to see quite a number of revolutions in 1848. So we see the introduction of free trade, free markets, free labor. And so as we move away from slavery to the use of more, maybe free labor, there are these debates over whether it's better to pay people and maybe not work them to death. And we are beginning to see that kind of argument begin to, now we are not saying that slavery ends. So for example, in places like Brazil, the New World, while slave trade is declining, we still see that people are held in slavery. But in places like Brazil, you see people working free labor, working alongside slave labor. And so, but we also begin to see the development of national identities, and we begin to see this with initially the French and then the Greeks, and later on we are going to see it with people like the Serbs, and the Germans and Italians, and so on. So one of the features that we actually see during this period is the growth of protest movements. And these movements are often led by prophets. They are led by radicals, by religious figures, by people who style themselves as sometimes reformers, but also sometimes as inspired people. But sometimes it's just someone who rises up and wants to create an empire or some other form of rule. Now, we'll see that a lot of these movements are going to be defeated, but they kind of give an alternative view to the voices of peasants and workers, and they do have some impact on policies. So, for example, one of the such movements that we are going to see is communism. And so today we have a number of countries that are led by communist forces. And so we see the development of alternative visions that are challenging European industrial capitalism. So, for example, socialism, we actually see movements in utopian socialism, which is kind of it's strange. The ideas of development of self-sustaining communities. We see ideas of social justice begin to emerge, but also the role of religion. So we are actually going to see religion being very important in these alternative movements. And so, for example, when we talk about revolts, so some of these are actual just the traditional revolts. So, for example, in China, we see quite a number of these. The Hui Muslim revolt that begins in 1862. Now, this revolt begins 2 years before the end of the Taiping Rebellion. And we're going to talk about the Taiping Rebellion as one of the really radical transformations of both religion but also social order. But again, we are going to see some natural phenomena causing these revolutions. For example, famines, epidemics. In China especially, we see environmental impacts. For example, dam breaks and so on. And so some of the outcomes, as we shall see, will include attempts at ethnic cleansing. But more importantly, I want us to keep in mind that there's going to be a lot of revolts, political alternatives, but we're also going to see imperial expansion and resistance to such imperial expansion, especially in Africa, in Asia, and so on. We already talked about China and how the US attempted to stop the colonization of China by insisting on an open door policy so that everyone could trade in China. And so now we have to ask ourselves, things like colonization, where do they occur? What gives rise to colonization? And so it's almost like we are going to see a replacement of empire. So, for example, the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal Empire are going to decline. So, where the British practice colonization of India, that is where the Mughal Empire used to be. We've looked at how the Ottoman Empire is being taken apart. So, for example, the French take over Algeria, the British support Greek independence. Egypt decides to go its own way. And so we have to sort of think about this as replacements and the rise of new empires and movements and so on. But also part of the reason that some of these empires are increasingly taken apart is because they do not modernize. And so the Industrial Revolution creates new weapons, new possibilities, but also new grievances that are going to be exploited. We see quite a bit of religious movements, lots of prophets and other self-styled such leaders, but also just charismatic leaders. Not all of them are going to be prophets. In places that are removed from global networks of trade, so for example, in West Africa, in Senegal, we are going to see the development of alternative forms of states that are not necessarily traditionally in the sort of Western context. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that only the places where global capitalism or industrialization see these changes. In fact, we see quite a bit of places looking towards past traditions. So, for example, and this is really just a slight preview, in places like the United States, as the United States expands westwards and displaces Native Americans, we are going to see self-styled leaders come up and say, Well, if we go back to our traditional beliefs and our practices, then we are going to be able to defeat these Westerners. And so some of their ideas are sort of blaming the victim, I think, but also there's a lot of emphasis on God's will, vehicles of purification, vehicles of renewal. But we also see the complete development of new polities, new countries. So where, although this was kind of not really controlled by the Ottoman Empire, the coasts of modern day Saudi Arabia were under the influence of the Ottoman Empire, but the Najd region, which is kind of what majority of Saudi Arabia and Yemen today is, were sort of like nomadic tribal groups. And so you begin to see the cooperation between tribal leaders and religious leaders. So, for example, Muhammad al-Wahab, who was Muslim Sunni cleric, joins forces with the al-Saud family. And so al-Saud was a tribal leader. And so he combines his leadership with the teachings of al-Wahab. And so he founds the Sunni Wahhabist nation that will become Saudi Arabia. And so although Saudi Arabia takes a few tries to actually become a country, so maybe 1822 is when we really begin to see the establishment of Saudi Arabia. You begin to see these alternative visions of statehood. And so Saudi Arabia becomes a theocracy, and we're going to see other theocracies. So, for example, in Sudan, there's going to be a Mahdist theocratic state that comes into conflict with the British. Eventually, the British prevail because they have more weapons, I think. Now, in places like Southwest Africa. So there were places that kind of stood at the periphery of. So if you think about a map of West Africa, majority of North and West Africa was influenced both by capitalism, even though it's the negative type of capitalism or slave trade, but was also majority primarily Muslim. Towards the coasts, you begin to see the influence of Christianity, but among groups such as the Fulanis and the Hausas, majority of the time you see Islam spreading to that part of the world, in part because of the trade networks, but also if you think about Mansa Musa and the Songhai Caliphate, it extended southwards. And so, for example, you have rulers such as Amina of the Hausa kingdoms. And so you're going to see the development of newer states or new forms of government that hearken to, so for example, the Sokoto Caliphate becomes a caliphate, and caliphates are usually Muslim, I want to call them states, even though these are previous forms of political organization, even though, for example, ISIS created what they called a caliphate, maybe not a state. Today there are few countries that call themselves caliphates, even though, for example, Saudi Arabia is a theocratic modern state. But so you're going to see people who are continuing to interact with elements of the past. So, for example, Fulanis, but also the ideas of attempting to relate to the pure past. For some reason, that cow showed up. The Fulanis were both sedentary, so they they were farmers, but also some were pastoralists, so kept animals. Now, especially with the Sokoto Caliphate, there were very interesting debates. So, in also maybe what we might consider pathologies. So, on the one hand, for example, you see the role of women being magnified. So, for example, Nana Asma, who was the daughter of Usman Dan Fodio, becoming an intellectual, but also accompanies warriors into battle, and is said to have thrown a spear at the enemy. So, sort of think about the expectations of the role of women in societies both then, but also in the context of caliphate. And so Usman Dan Fodio creates a caliphate, the Sokoto Caliphate, draws inspiration from the life of Muhammad, and then declares jihad against people who are not, observing good, or who are not believers. So again, goes back to like the Crusades, so almost 800 years before that. And so these are going to be some of the newer forms of statehood that we are going to see. And there's quite a number of these. So for example, if you look at a map of Africa in the 1800s, you begin to see the reconstitution of these empires, these caliphates. So for example, in Algeria, in Libya, and so especially in Libya, there was a caliphate in that region called Kanem and Bornu, two kingdoms, Muslim, extended all the way to almost Nigeria. And so where you see Nigeria, that's where we also had the six Hausa kingdoms that at some point were led by Amina. So again, think about how there's hybridity, including in areas that we do not expect. So for example, leadership by women. In places like the Sudan, as I mentioned, we see the Mahdi rising up and creating this Mahdist state. But again, you see it rises in 1880s. 1880s is, especially 1882, is just 2 years before Europeans divide Africa into colonies. And so the Mahdist state will actually run into the British coming in from Egypt, and the French coming in from some people call it the armpit of Africa. I think that's just wrong. But so the areas of New Calabar, Guinea, Accra, so what would become the Congo. So again, you're finding these newer state forms running into the old states and fighting each other. Now, most of us, or most of us will be familiar with, for example, Shaka and his Zulu kingdom. But what maybe most of us are not familiar with is that Shaka actually, so the Zulu had other related groups. So for example, the Sodo, the Ndebele, and all the way up to the Nguni, who were in Tanzania. And so these are Bantu groups that split off of each other, that use the same kind of fighting tactics. And so Shaka begins to form his kingdom in the 1820s, 1822, I think. And so this is also the period of time when the British are beginning to take over from the Dutch in South Africa. Remember, the Dutch had immigrated to South Africa. They had started farming wheat and grapes and other things. And so they decide they are going to take over South Africa. But also towards the western side of, so this region is going to be controlled by the Portuguese. actually they controlled the western side. Remember, they were capturing Africans and taking them across to Brazil. But also on the eastern side of Mozambique, the Portuguese want to control that whole area. And so they are running into the British. They're running into what are now calling themselves the Boers, who are Dutch descendants of Dutch peoples, intermarrying with the British and Africans. And so there's a lot of conflict. And so the Zulu, for example, are going to be moved into what is eventually known as the Transvaal region near Swaziland. So it's a period of time when there's lots of flux. New nations are forming, old nations are being, but also there's still attempts at establishing new. So, for example, the Zulus really do try to establish their nation. And in 1879, they actually become one of the two African groups that defeat European colonialists. The other one being the Ethiopians in 1896. So sort of think about these leaders, these self-styled leaders, and what they are trying to do. So yeah, Shaka creates a warrior state that actually defeats the British, and in part it's because of the new tactics that he adopts. So the Zulus would have this large shield. They would have two spears. One would be, well, the longer spear, and then they would have what they call the assegai, which was a short stabbing spear. And then they refine military tactics, including, for example, the horns of the bull, which they use quite a bit. And so, for example, in 1879, they defeat the British at what is called the Battle of Isandlwana. And so, again, by 1900, they are going to be defeated by the British and confined into what are called Bantustans. Sort of like, think about the Native Americans being confined into time escapes me. Now, let's pivot for a minute to other places where we see the growth of these rebellions. And so we mentioned the China as one of the places where rebellions were constant, in part because it's a lot of territory. You're ruling over people who do not like you. And so one of the most significant rebellions is generally referred to as the Taiping Rebellion. So the Taiping Rebellion begins about 1850, and it has a very interesting beginning. Now, the context of the Taiping Rebellion is that the British are trying to take apart China. So we saw the Opium Wars and how these. So the first Opium War, 1839 to 1842, the Treaty of Nanking. 1856, there's going to be another Opium War that is going to have even more of the same, including the opening of another 10 ports and all kinds of other humiliations of the Chinese. Now, in 1850, there arises this individual who is like, he sees visions. And so he decides, well, on the one part, he is converting to Christianity. On the other, he is looking at people who are ruling China and thinking, well, he actually calls them demons and things like that. And so the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom is founded by Hong Xiquan. who was kind of, so he was from Guangdong. He met Christian missionaries, but his whole visions begin when he fails the Chinese civil service exam. Took it 4 times, failed 4 times, and then he starts seeing these visions and interpreting them as to suggest that he is Jesus' younger brother, and he is sent to maybe save the Chinese from the Qing Empire, save the world from evil. Yeah, so he visions. So some people will call the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom a sect. And so he begins to preach and baptize people. But again, you have to remember that China is at this time mostly Taoist, Buddhist. And so this, the encroachment of Christianity is actually against Chinese Qing Empire ideas. And so it's almost like he's cavorting with the enemy. And so he gets his followers initially from like the outer reaches of society. He is preaching, I think, things that people can identify with. So, for example, new era of economic and social justice, revitalization and restoration. But then, so he begins to gain these followers, and the Qing rulers want to arrest the rebel leaders, and then he declares himself the heavenly king of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And of course, most countries do not want to have contending kings, even though I think from a religious perspective, I mean, do people declare themselves kings of heaven? But anyway, so he actually begins to kill the Manchus, who are the Manchus are the group that formed the Qing Empire. And so when he begins to kill them, it's sort of like, well, now you're killing our people and we can't maybe do that. So, but he actually describes them as demons and other things. And so this is kind of where his rebellion begins. And you can sort of see where it begins towards the north in Suzhou, Nanjing, and then begins to expand. And so, of course, the Qing Empire has to contain this. Now, at the same time that the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom or Taiping Rebellion is going on, we have other rebellions towards the northwest, the Xinjiang region towards the north, Nian, and so it's a period of general Chinese weakness. Now, we have to also appreciate that the British actually support the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, because their whole goal is to take apart China. And so if you can support a Christian religious sect, that is good, because then you are weakening the government because it's not able to fight you. So we see the growth of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. So it lasts about 13 years. And as I mentioned, the followers come from the margins of society. But interestingly, and we're going to see this maybe 100 years later, what Hong is preaching is contrary to general practices in China. So, for example, he talks about equality. He talks about women being able to serve in the bureaucracy, in the military, getting land, so land is being divided equally. But on the other hand, he is doing things that are losing him followers. So, for example, people could not smoke opium or consume alcohol, which I think might be a good thing, so they converts. But then he goes overboard and talks about Manchu rulers as demons and obstacles to realizing God's kingdom on, so not indulge in sensual pleasure. So he had a bit of mixed message, I would argue. So initially, we actually see Europeans supporting this rebellion because one of the three major figures in the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was seen as a Westerner and a Christianizer, so Hong Rengan. But then there was a lot of struggles within the leadership. In fact, it is said that one of the three leaders was killed. But also the codes of conduct, but also because China was a multi-ethnic society, some of the Han ethnic groups began to support the Manchus. And so you remember that the Han were the majority group in China. And so if you lose the support of the majority, then maybe you kind of are going to lose. Now, rebellions in China kind of have very high death rates. So, for example, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom is said to have killed between 20 million and 30 million. And so, again, the Hui Rebellion also had about 20 million. The Lushan Rebellion also had about 20 to 30 million. So again, think about what afflicts countries and how they become weaker. And so, for example, in China, this becomes one of the rebellions that is going on at the same time the European powers are trying to take apart China. Now, it wasn't just in China or in West Africa or in other places. These rebellions and alternative visions were going on in many other places. So, for example, in Europe, even though we actually see European societies as being more maybe prone to stability, we see developments or the rise of self-styled opposition leaders, alternative views. And so we see quite a number of a spectrum of alternative thinking. So socialists, radicals, liberals, utopian socialists. And so, for example, the utopian socialists are trying to figure out Europe is in the middle of economic or the Industrial Revolution. What is the best way to assure industrial growth, but also that people are not working 18 hours a day, that they are making money, that it's not just the industrialists that are making money? And so you see the rise of utopian socialists who are like, well, if we own all the property, maybe we are going to be happier. You begin to see the rise of nationalists, people who are interested in the strength of the nations that they, or beginning to see themselves as nationalists, but also expanding from the context of being members of a nation. You're also going to see other groups of people. So, for example, abolitionists, people who are opposed to slavery. And so, ironically, although the slave trade ended, well, or at least decreased from about 1807, 1808, within nations, the slave trade did not end. I've mentioned previously that, for example, there was a Richmond slave market that sold about 300,000 people between 1807 and 1860. But also we are seeing other people who are advocating for things like universal suffrage. So think about the Seneca Falls Convention, but also think about the Chartist movement, which begins in Britain and collects a whole bunch of signatures urging that people should be allowed to vote. But also we still see the differences. So, for example, the Chartist movement is arguing that only men should be able to vote. But what about women? But we also see then religious mavericks and other kinds of radicals. So, for example, Marxists and socialists. And so, even though I'm suggesting that Europe was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution from about 1800 to about 1900, it also saw other social movements. So remember the French Revolution, remember the Napoleonic Wars that end in 1815, that are then followed by what is generally referred to as the Restoration period, the restoration of European monarchs, beginning with the French monarchy. And so as a reaction to these movements, we see the rise of radicalism. And so radicalists included a whole bunch of stripes. So, for example, the nihilists believed that government should be abolished. And so, what do you do if you don't have government? You have the Jacobins and the nationalists and the utopian socialists, and all of these have some way that they see the world as working the best. But also liberals who are suggesting that aristocratic privilege, the monarchies should be overthrown. But we actually see the Restoration period lasting from about 1815 to about 1848, when we then see people like Louis Napoleon III, Napoleon Bonaparte's cousin, actually doing a revolution, a coup, and overthrowing these monarchies that were restored. And so you actually find Europe at this period of time being beset by a lot of unrest, a lot of revolutions, a lot of government overthrows. So, for example, in Austria, in France, in Germany, but these are actually sites of rebellion. We mentioned, for example, in Russia, 1825, there was an attempt to overthrow Alexander, or to prohibit Nicholas I from rising to the throne. And so the idea was that Russia should embrace republicanism, the idea of being ruled with a constitution. So we see this, the development of some radical visions. So ideas about how do you rule the state, who should have power. And so it's before these revolutions have stabilized, we see quite a bit of reconfiguration, but we also see quite a bit of radicalism. Now, later on in the 1880s, radicalism will return in places like Russia. But also, so you have different groups like radicals, but you also have nationalists who are trying to, in the countries that were controlled by Europeans, they are trying to establish, you might call it home rule. In places where they were disunited, for example, in Germany or in Italy, they are trying to consolidate the nation as a republic. So they are saying we share the same language, history, culture, and therefore we should be one nation. And so the idea of nationalism goes against, so you have to see that as set against, for example, the aristocrats who saw themselves as more connected to each other. But so these elements of nationalism by liberals, people who see themselves as sharing a common language, culture, and history, but also people who see themselves as radicals who want to get rid of the old order and create these new nations. Now, we mentioned nationalism, even though in places like Switzerland, there were three different linguistic groups, but they also still saw themselves as members of the same nation. In Belgium, they had three major languages, and so it's not like this, but they would consider themselves, for example, French or Belgian or Swiss. And so later on, we're going to see the consolidation of countries such as Italy and Germany. And later on, we're going to see how this consolidation is actually a terrible thing, because the Germans are going to, want to exclude everyone else, sometimes in very destructive ways. So, for example, the murder of Jewish people. But it's important to think about the 1800s as the rise of nationalism. And so some of those include the creation of countries. So, for example, Greece becomes a country, France becomes a country, Germany becomes a country. But the other part to this is that these nationalist movements are also suppressing other people. So, for example, the Serbs find themselves suppressed and trying to unify themselves as a country. And in fact, this is part of what's going to lead to the First World War. So people are willing to fight and die for the idea that they were connected to each other by history, language, culture, and maybe the future. Now, there was another group that arises in Europe around the mid 19th century, so about 1830s, 1840s, and this is the socialists and the communists. Socialism and communism arises particularly from the issue of industrial capitalism and how it is treating people who are working in factories and so on. As I previously mentioned, until 1928, there were no rules as to how long you could work. Now, Britain had some that were enacted in the 1830s, 1840s, but the idea of the factories as being soulless, just production. Actually, some of them were called satanic meals. Like the conditions were just terrible. And so the question was, what is the best form of development, but also production? And so socialists and communists have this idea that you can transform production to save people from self-destruction. And so you actually find people who are working in these kinds of factories being drawn to these ideas. So whether we are talking about ordinary workers, artisans, domestic servants, women, but again, as I mentioned, women are often excluded from the consideration of should they even be working in mines? Do they have the right to make those kinds of decisions? And so this is kind of what, when you think about socialism, the idea was to figure out answers to the social question. Questions, for example, who should vote? Who should rule? How long should people work? What is the place of women? Should women vote? Should they be able to make decisions about their own lives? And so you actually find very unusual figures. So most people will associate J.S. Mills with, for example, the development of markets and so on. But so he and his wife were actually significantly involved in these questions. Campaign for the equality of sexes, which was very ahead of its time, but also how workers can express themselves in their conditions. So, for example, the killing of protesters, but also now coming to issues like voting, universal suffrage, secret ballots, equal electoral districts, but also annual parliamentary elections, which I think was quite a bit. I mean, imagine if you went to elections every year. But so these are some of those major issues. The challenge was, for example, you see, universal suffrage was suggested for adult males. What about women? What about their working in factories? What was the place of women, and should they even be working in mines and those kinds of places? So these become attempts at addressing these new realities of factory production, of new ways of being. But then you actually have these people who are a little strange, one might say. So, for example, Charles Fourier, who now styles himself in this style of visionary. So, believes himself to be a scientific prophet of a future world. So, again, really in the middle of Europe. Dislike merchants and middlemen, and these are again from his experiences, division of labor. And so he talks about organization as reordering labor, but also suggests that people should organize in phalanxes of 1,500 people, so like communes. And he had some dislike for adolescents and decides that undesirable work should fall to adolescents, which society sometimes today does. So think about, for example, food production, but also the food industry and who it mostly employs. It's very rare to find an adolescent who is a middle manager somewhere. Now, so some of his writings gained popularity 1830s, but this is also the period of time when socialism is gaining a lot of following. Some women thought that this was a good thing, and so if you sort of think about Christianity and ideas of Christian sharing and so on. But then this is sort of like the commune that he sort of suggested people should live in. Ideas that would be adopted, for example, by Cambodia in the 1970s, where they would have like a group of parents raising all the young kids in an area, and everyone else was working together, which is kind of like the worst version of socialism. And so people are trying to figure out what is the best way to organize labor and those kinds of things. Now, perhaps maybe some of the most influential are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Ironically, Friedrich Engels, who writes The Condition of the Working Class in England, his father owned a factory in England. And so he visited the factory and he thought that capitalist production was just terrible. And so he writes this book. Later on, they are going to write the Communist Manifesto together with Karl Marx. And so some of their major arguments included that in history, what was important was the production of material goods. Society is divided into classes, producers and exploiters, and that eventually, so the history of all of history is really marked by class warfare. So whether it's the aristocrats against commoners or now industrialists against workers. And so he calls, or Marxists are calling upon workers to overthrow the capitalist class and, eventually own the means of production. And so according to Marx and Engels, now, again, it's important to think about when they are writing and what the context is. So they thought that history moved from feudalism to capitalism, and so the next stage was going to be socialism, and then scientific socialism or communism. So scientific socialism is often conflated with communism, and so if you actually think about, so for example, the Soviet Union used to call itself Marxist Leninist society, so everything was owned in common. And so these are other examples of how people are trying to figure out production, ownership, fairness. And so he in the Communist Manifesto, as I mentioned, there was a call for workers of all nations to overthrow capitalism and own the means of production. Now, coincidentally, 1848, there was the European Spring that overthrew quite a number of governments, including Austria, Czechoslovakia, Italy, and France. This is when Louis Napoleon gets back in power. But that's not kind of what Marx was talking about. He was talking about the means of production. And so it's important to sort of think about these European developments and what the intention was. But so more broadly to see, especially 1815 to about 1850 as a period when Europe was in flux. And the biggest question was, what are the best ways to organize production, to organize states, to organize society, to organize production, but also, what are the units of authority? So states, what is a state? How is it organized? Who is in charge? All of those kinds of questions. Now,